Hello, I'm Flora, speaking up and out, and thank you for joining me this evening. I have a very happy memory, right as far back as I can remember, of the two old ladies living in our home while I was growing up. There was my grandmother May and my great aunt Mary. My grandmother May came to us when she was about 70, and Aunt Mary was already in her 80s. And these two lovely old women lived in our home till they died. I was quite young still when Aunt Mary died. All I really remember about her is her black hair and her shining, brilliant, dark eyes. But my grandmother was an enormous influence over my life. She taught me to draw, she taught me to paint, she taught me to sew. And now, of course, I regret I didn't ask her a million questions about her very remarkable life. Aunt Mary had had a very sad life. Her husband had died, all her babies had died, and she was left with no money whatever. And my mother hopped in the car and crossed the whole state to bring Aunt Mary home to stay with us. It worked for us pretty well because my home had enough space in it for each old lady to have her own room. Very unlike my own mother when she was growing up, and a grandfather from one side of the family and a grandmother from the other side of the family who had no money moved in with them. And they had to have separate rooms, of course, because they weren't married. And my mother and her sister had to sleep in the hallway in curtained off cubicles because there was not enough room for everyone to have a bedroom of their own. It all worked out very well, though, for them and for me too, because, having an older person in the home to help watch out for the children, and the feeling of the multi-generational aspect, where young people live with old people and old people with young people. It's when it works, it's a wonderful situation. But it doesn't always work. In some cases, everyone's nerves are on edge. There's no privacy, whatever. There are power struggles, and it's very difficult. But back in those days, there was no alternative if you were elderly without your salary anymore, retired, if you didn't have savings, and it wasn't always possible to build up savings. If you weren't happy with your family, or if you didn't have a family, or they weren't happy with you, then you would go to an old people's home, is what they called it, which was not a happy place to be, often very inferior care, medical and otherwise, or even worse, to a poor farm. I spoke of that earlier when I first began my talks with you. There was called a poor farm about a mile up the main street from my home, and we drove by it so often, and nothing could have looked more desolate than the bleak fields, sometimes people working in them, wearing poor clothes. Husbands and wives are usually separated in those poor farms. It became a kind of nightmare thing to me every time we drove by it. You see, these were the days before Social Security. And this month is the 90th birthday of Social Security, which President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, enacted into law, 1935. Several good things happened that same month. The 40-hour week, for example, and the idea of minimum wage for the first time in law. That had never been thought of before. But Social Security was the main thing. And he had to fight like a tiger to get it passed because the reactionaries in Congress hated the very thought of such a thing, just like, well, I get to what's happening now later. They called it communism. They called it the end of American tough independence. Everybody for himself. And this, they said, on the worst, the middle of the worst depression the nation's ever had, when so-called American tough independence was going down the drain, what with starvation, homelessness, suicide, living on the streets, people jumping out of windows. I'm not exaggerating. I think the country was in more danger then than it's ever been since. And nevertheless, they fought him. They didn't want federal support for the homeless, for the old, for anybody. I was 7 years old when this Social Security was passed, and just beginning to tune in every now and then to the pundits on the radio. That was our main media form, of course, the radio and newsreels. And there was a phrase that I latched onto that the reactionary pundits were using, that Roosevelt was, quote unquote, fouling his own nest. And I asked my parents, what does that mean? And they said, well, to boil it down, it means a bird who's making his home unlivable. They called it fouling his nest because he was born into a very wealthy family, long genealogical of famous people, in a beautiful estate of conservative family. But he was different. Franklin Roosevelt, with all his faults, cared about the poor, the out of work, with the desperate, with the old people who had no more salary and maybe little or no savings. He cared about them. He fought for them. And now, of course, we can hardly imagine doing without it. Social Security now serves about just under 70 million people. A major income for many, many millions, those over 65. And yet it's threatened today as it hasn't been since its very beginning. Part of the reason is no one's fault, that as old people live longer, there are fewer young people to keep it built up. And everyone agrees that in about 10 years from now, it will not be anymore able to pay 100% to people who need it. Only about 81% of those funds will be due to people. All right, the trouble is no one is giving any intelligent planning, and it is spoken of with contempt by, well, good old Elon Musk calls it a Ponzi scheme. Trump says that checks fraudulently are going to millions of people who are dead, which is a barefaced lie, typical of him. Trump has seen to it that 7,000 people have been cut from the workforce of Social Security. Offices have been closed. All kinds of ideas are floating around now, some crazier than others. No real work is being done at it. But here's one idea, for example. Stop going, no longer allow the annual payment to go up to meet the cost of living, which is rising. Some people say cut that out, so the payment is always the same, never mind the cost of living. And this is at a time when the cost of living is going up astronomically. A second idea, and this is one very favored by Trump and his team, reactionaries in general. Privatize it. That is, allow people when they retire to use the funds not to be paid by the federal government, but to invest as they please, which is a terrible idea because if you invest foolishly, you can lose it all over again. The idea they started was that these would be federally guaranteed, federally protected, so nobody investing in a bad scheme will lose it all again. They will have it defended, guaranteed to depend on. A third idea is increase the retirement age. There's a possibility there, going up maybe to 67 instead of 65. Now that we're living longer and healthfully, more healthfully anyway, how long that will last, who knows, with maybe vaccination no longer being paid for by insurance, or some vaccinations ruled out entirely. How long will we live healthfully? Another idea, fourth one, is give everyone, no matter how rich or poor, the same amount, depending on whether they worked the same number of years. A fifth idea, and personally I would hope for this, limiting the benefits for the very wealthy who just use their monthly check as pocket change. But that will be fought, of course, by the wealthy, because they will say, then I'm making a donation, which is not my free will to make. So that would really cause a battle. No politician now is saying, let's try to kill it off. No politician is saying, let's just slash it across the board, the way they're doing with Medicaid, for example, because all politicians know that would be a doomed statement if they came out openly against Medicare. I think they're just trying, the reactionaries, Trump's team, just to let it die, quietly let it die without any fuss at all, by continually cutting down the workforce, continually telling lies about it, continually not making any long-term sensible plans at all to preserve it. Will it live to its 100th birthday? I probably won't be here to see it. I'm praying it will. I'm haunted by the vision of that poor farm and wondering if they'll be springing up again, those desolate places. They say that you can judge the health of a civilization, or for that matter, a city, a state, or nation, by the care they give the poor, the disabled, the very young, and the very old. There are civilizations that abandon the old people out in the wilderness as no longer useful. Quite a lot of civilizations used to do that, and some animals do that too. But there are other civilizations, and I'm thinking of one among the Native Americans early on, that took special care of the old people as the memory keepers, the storytellers, the wisdom holders. And even if they had no families, they would see to it that these old people were fed, supported, sheltered, honored by the culture around them. I've also, though that was a fact, can be documented, I've also heard, and I can't document this one, but it seems to me I remember reading articles or seeing nature shows that tells us that elephants protect their old and their sick. That an old elephant, when he's walking or she's walking, will be surrounded by young, healthy elephants. And if the elephant falls ill, they will see to it that it lies on the ground surrounded by caretakers, food brought. And if an elephant dies, they mourn it. They stand around and mourn it. Maybe some of you out there who know a lot about elephants can tell me if this is a true story that I actually did read or see in a documentary. But I can't say I've proved it because I don't have a book in front of me to prove it to you. So instead, I will just say, as from one elephant to the other, thank you for being here tonight, and see you next week.